April 1976. Manny Duarte had been driving the 4 to midnight shift out of Yellow Cab's Turk Street garage for 11 years. He picked up a fare outside the St. Francis Hotel that afternoon. A couple with luggage already stacked at the curb, headed for the airport, and by the time he'd dropped them at the international terminal and turned the cab back toward the city, the dispatcher's voice on the radio was carrying something other than an address. The union had gone to court. The company's accounts had been frozen. Something had happened to the pension fund. The money drivers had been promised in exchange for exactly this kind of shift, year after year. And nobody on the radio yet knew how much of it was actually gone. Duarte didn't know it that afternoon, but the shortfall would turn out to be more than $1 million. He didn't know that within days, 500 cabs would sit idle in garages across the city, or that the company he'd driven for since 1965 would never open its doors again under that name. All he knew, driving back across town with an empty back seat, was that something in the machine he worked inside of, a machine he had never once had reason to think about, because it always simply paid him at the end of the week, had stopped functioning the way it was supposed to. He finished the shift anyway. He drove the last fare of the night, a nurse coming off a hospital shift near the Tenderloin, and clocked out at the Turk Street garage the way he had 11 years running. What had 11 years of shift work actually secured for a San Francisco cab driver in 1976? And what happens to that security when the company holding it turns out to have been quietly emptied from the inside? The cab Duarte drove that year was a Checker, the same fleet vehicle that by the mid-1970s had become the default taxi across most major American cities, San Francisco included. A high-roofed, heavy-bodied sedan built specifically for taxi service, not adapted from a passenger car afterward. It was not comfortable the way a private car was comfortable. It was comfortable the way a tool is comfortable. Deep bench seats, a floor built to be swept out at the end of a shift, a body designed to survive a decade of curb strikes and hill starts without complaint. The system underneath the vehicle was less visible and far less durable. San Francisco taxi service ran on permits, not medallions bought and sold between drivers the way New York's worked. In 1976, Yellow Cab held roughly 500 of the city's taxi permits, not individual drivers, the company itself. A driver's paycheck was tied to that company. The company's health depended on decisions made in a boardroom no driver ever saw. Under the contract in effect, a yellow driver earned $16 a day or half the metered fares, whichever was greater, plus a monthly health and welfare payment, plus a small daily contribution toward a pension. The exact fund that spring, was found to be short by more than $1 million. The formal system provided a wage floor, a health plan, and a promise of retirement income. What it did not provide, could not provide, was any way for a driver to see, from the front seat of a Checker at 11 at night, that the company holding all of it belonged to a conglomerate built around a bank that was already failing. Before we go further, if this kind of documentation matters to you, consider subscribing. Every video here goes into one specific aspect of American cab culture: the vehicle, the shift, the permit system, the dispatcher, and the specific knowledge of the driver who knew their city in a way no app has replicated. The driver who kept working through the shutdown and the buyout knew something no bankruptcy filing could show: which hills to take slow, which fog patterns meant a rush at the wharf, and which hotel doorman would flag a cab before the tourist even stepped outside. And if you drove a cab in this era, or your family did, leave it in the comments. If you drove for a San Francisco cab company in the 1970s or 80s, Yellow, DeSoto, Luxor, Veterans, City, what do you remember about the year the city's cabs almost stopped running? The permit fight that followed would decide, by popular vote, who in this city was allowed to own a taxi at all, a question worth its own future video. Back to the cab. To understand what happened to that pension fund, you have to look past the cab company entirely, to the conglomerate that owned it. Yellow Cab's parent was built around a bank holding company, and by 1976 that bank was failing. Investigators later found that funds had been drained out of the subsidiaries under its control, including the taxi company, to prop up the bank and an affiliated insurance operation. The cab company's contribution to its own drivers' pensions had been one of the accounts raided. The conglomerate's chief executive was eventually convicted and sent to prison. By then, the damage inside Yellow Cab was already done. For a city that leaned on taxis to move visitors between hotels, restaurants, and the airport in a way no bus line or streetcar route fully replicated, the prospect of losing 500 cabs overnight was not an abstract labor dispute. It was a hole opening in the middle of how San Francisco actually moved. In April 1976, with the pension shortfall confirmed at more than $1 million, the drivers' union went to court and won an attachment of the company's assets. Yellow Cab shut down for 11 days. 500 cabs sat in garages across the city. 950 drivers, men and women who, like Duarte, had built years of specific knowledge of specific streets, had nowhere to report for a shift that no longer existed. The company reopened briefly under bankruptcy protection. It did not last. By December 1976, San Francisco's largest taxi operator, the one company that alone held roughly 500 of the city's operating permits, had ceased business for good. 950 drivers still existed. 500 permits still existed. On paper, somewhere in a bankruptcy filing. What no longer existed was any functioning connection between the two. A taxi permit in San Francisco was not a car, and it was not a company. It was a piece of paper that gave its holder the legal right to put a metered cab on the street, and with Yellow Cab defunct, roughly 500 of those pieces of paper were suddenly unattached to any operator at all. What followed was not a quick reissue. The mayor's office declined to simply revoke the dead company's permits and hand out new ones. Instead, a deal surfaced to transfer the permits to a new operator. A deal arranged, it turned out, by a partner in the mayor's own law firm. The arrangement drew immediate criticism over the appearance of political favoritism, and it collapsed before it could be completed. The suspicion of permit speculation, the idea that a scarce piece of city paper, worth far more than the taxi it authorized, might change hands based on political connections rather than driving experience, pushed the Board of Supervisors to act. They passed a measure barring the outright transfer of permits between parties. The mayor vetoed it. The matter went to San Francisco voters directly. And in 1978, it passed as Proposition K, a rule that grandfathered the permits already in existence, but required that from then on, every new taxi medallion in San Francisco could go only to a working driver, never to an investor, a company, or an absentee owner. For close to a year, San Francisco had unusually sparse cab service, while this fight played out in court, in the board chambers, and eventually at the ballot box. 500 drivers who had once worked the same shifts, the same hotel stands, the same airport queue, were, for the length of that year, simply waiting. What ended the waiting was not a single ruling. It was a coalition. Drivers, dispatchers, mechanics, and a handful of outside investors who took their case directly to federal bankruptcy court and asked for something unusual, the right to buy the defunct company themselves. The court agreed. By November 1977, the cabs that had once belonged to a bank-holding conglomerate belonged, on paper, to the people who had spent years driving, dispatching, and repairing them. What those people brought to the deal wasn't capital. It was the specific, accumulated knowledge of a city that does not sit flat. A driver who had worked San Francisco's hills for a decade knew which grades you took in a low gear, rather than riding the brake the whole way down, which intersections fogged in first on a summer evening, even when 3 blocks away it was still clear, which hotel doorman, at which entrance, would flag a cab before the guest had finished stepping outside, and which fare, picked up at the top of a hill at 11 at night, was headed to the airport, and which was headed nowhere in particular. None of that was written down anywhere the bankruptcy court could read. It existed only in the drivers who were about to become, for the first time, part owners of the company whose cabs they drove. That kind of knowledge did not distinguish between the financial district at 9 in the morning and a residential hillside at midnight. A driver who worked both shifts carried two entirely different mental maps of the same several square miles. Published accounts from San Francisco cab drivers of this era describe a working life built almost entirely out of exactly this kind of accumulated, ungraded knowledge, the specific read of a specific street at a specific hour, learned by doing it, shift after shift, for years. The coalition that bought Yellow Cab in 1977 had that knowledge in abundance. What it did not yet know was what kind of company it had actually just bought. A cooperative is a form of ownership. It is not by itself a guarantee of income. The Yellow Cab that emerged from bankruptcy in 1977 held its permits collectively and structured itself around driver ownership, a genuinely different model from the leased medallion system used in most other American cities. But the day-to-day economics that drivers actually worked under changed just as much as the ownership structure did. The old Yellow contract, $16 a day or half the fares, health and welfare payments, a pension fund, was gone with the company that had signed it. By 1979, the terms available to a driver working a shift for the reorganized Yellow Cab looked much closer to the leasing arrangements that had always applied at San Francisco's smaller companies. Roughly $32 for the shift itself, plus another $13 for gasoline, with no health plan and no pension attached to the lease. The ownership had changed hands. The economic risk of a slow night had not gone anywhere. If anything, it now sat more squarely on the individual driver leasing a shift than it had under the old union contract. San Francisco voters were not deciding an abstract question about labor law. They were deciding, on a single ballot measure, whether the mechanism that had just failed, a taxi company's ownership sitting inside a distant, unrelated conglomerate, could be legally reconstructed by the next ambitious buyer who came along. What Proposition K secured wasn't a wage. It was a structural guarantee that could not be undone by the next conglomerate that wanted to buy in. From 1978 forward, a San Francisco taxi permit could belong only to someone who actually drove a cab. Whatever else changed about pay, benefits, or lease terms, the specific failure of 1976, a distant, unrelated business raiding a taxi company's pension fund to cover its own losses, could not, structurally, happen again in quite the same way. For the next several decades, that structure held. Yellow Cab's cooperative drivers carried San Francisco's hotel doors, its airport runs, its hill routes, and its fog-bound waterfront nights, the way any large fleet does. One fare, one shift, one hill at a time. By the 2010s, the company that had been rebuilt out of a 1976 bankruptcy had grown into San Francisco's largest taxi operator. More than 500 medallions, the biggest fleet in the city, decades removed from the crisis that had created it. It did not survive intact. Two forces converged on the cooperative that the drivers of 1977 could not have anticipated. The first was litigation, a series of accident settlements, including a single 2015 judgment of roughly $8 million awarded to a passenger paralyzed in a crash, accumulated faster than the company's self-insurance reserves could absorb. The second was competition that had nothing to do with permits, pensions, or bankruptcy courts at all. Ride-hailing services that didn't need a San Francisco taxi medallion to pick up a fare. The same pressure was, by then, driving medallion and permit values down in nearly every American city built around a similar licensing structure. San Francisco's cooperative was simply large enough and burdened with enough accumulated legal liability to feel the full weight of both forces at once. In January 2016, San Francisco's Yellow Cab Cooperative filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the same legal process that, 4 decades earlier, had been the mechanism of its birth. By 2017, its name, its phone number, and its remaining assets were sold at federal bankruptcy auction to a competing operator for roughly $810,000, a fraction of what the underlying medallions alone had once been worth. The structure Proposition K had built to prevent one kind of collapse, an absentee owner raiding a driver-dependent business from the outside, had held for nearly 40 years. It had no answer at all for a competitor that didn't need permits, drivers, or a taxi stand to operate in the same city. What the Yellow Cab Cooperative's 40-year life reveals is not a simple story about labor triumph or corporate failure. It is a more specific one, a piece of urban infrastructure. The right to put a metered cab on a San Francisco street survived one kind of threat by putting ownership directly in the hands of the people who did the driving, dispatching, and repairing. That structure held exactly as long as the threat stayed the kind it was built to answer. When a different kind of threat arrived, one that operated entirely outside the permit system Proposition K had been designed to protect, the cooperative's structural strength gave it decades, but not permanence. That is not a verdict on cooperative ownership itself. Plenty of driver-owned systems elsewhere never faced a rival business model this well capitalized. But it is a specific, documented limit on what Proposition K's particular safeguard was built to do. If this channel is worth subscribing to, that's how you tell us. The driver who lived through the 1976 shutdown and the 1977 buyout knew the city's hills and fog patterns in a way no algorithm has ever needed to. And if you have a cab story from this era, as a driver, as a regular passenger, as someone whose city this was, write it in the comments. If you drove for a San Francisco cab company in this era, we'd like to know which garage, which years, which shift. Manny Duarte retired from driving in the early 1990s. He never owned a permit outright. Under Yellow's original structure, they had all belonged to the company, and later to the cooperative collectively. But for the last 15 years of his career, he had been a part owner of the company whose cab he drove. In a way no driver on his old 1972 contract had ever been. What the record shows, shifts worked. A company that failed once and was rebuilt once by the people who worked inside it. What the record doesn't show, which hill grades he took in second gear, which hotel doorman he could count on, which fog pattern meant a rush at the wharf at 11 at night. That went with him. The next driver who took his shift learned the hills the same way Duarte had, by driving them, at night, in the fog, until they weren't unknown anymore.